Hello, my name is Ethan Souter,
And my name is Quinlan Williams.
and welcome to the Stuff Podcast.
Today we will be talking about the Titanic, why it was built, how it was built, and why it sank.
Yeah, I think we should start with why it was built first.
Sure. So, the Titanic was built to be the biggest ocean liner to ever sail. It was part of a project that included three ships known as the Titanic, the Olympic, and the Britannic. They were all initially designed to be like passenger ships, but the Olympic was eventually commissioned as a medic ship in World War One.
Yeah, what happened to the Britannic?
The Britannic hit a torpedo at some point, or was hit by a torpedo, and blew up and sank within, I think it was 54 minutes. Very quickly.
Did the Olympic sink?
The Olympic was hit multiple times in war, but it never actually sank and was eventually decommissioned at the end of World War One.
Okay.
The Titanic went on to continue its legacy as a passenger ship, but it did sink on its maiden voyage, meaning it could never be commissioned as a ship in World War One.
Yeah, I think we should talk about its maiden voyage now. Like, why did it sink?
Well, first we should probably go over how it was built.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So, in 1910, the Titanic project was started, and it was built in a shipyard in Ireland. And very many Irish workers who were poorer were hired to work on the project. The ship hull was built in a dry dock and was eventually slid down on a slip, which did cause one casualty of some guy getting crushed by a wooden post.
Dang. So they used the slip to get the Titanic from the dock to the water?
Yeah, they used the slip to slide it down using like oil. They greased it up with oil and then slid the ship hull down into the ocean.
What happened
Or
next?
not the ocean, the bay. After that, the Titanic was towed by tugboats to another port where it was fitted with its engines, its boilers, all of its furniture, its smokestacks, amongst other things.
How long did the building process take?
It took about 2 years from start to finish.
That's not that long.
It was not short. I mean,
Yeah.
but at the time, since it was a big ship, it was pretty fast. Instead of manually putting in each rivet, they had rivet guns, which were newer at the time. And the Titanic was the second of the three ships to be completed. The Olympic was first, Titanic was second, and Britannic was third. And after it was fitted with all its stuff, it was sent out for its sea trials to make sure it was worthy to sail across the ocean.
And it passed those, right?
It did pass those very easily. The standards were lower back then because there had never really been any massive disasters.
Like the Titanic.
Like the Titanic, yes. So, after her sea trials, she was moved to Liverpool to get her first passengers for her maiden voyage. She picked up most passengers there, but also sailed around the rest of Europe to pick up more people before starting its transatlantic voyage. Now, where should we go from there?
I think we should talk about how the events right before it sunk, like the iceberg.
Sure. So, in the days leading up to the disaster, they were pretty anticlimactic. The passengers were enjoying themselves on the ship, as it was the most luxurious ship in the world.
Yeah.
At the time. Which, I mean, the ship had its own pool, it had a gym area, smoking rooms, many restaurants that were very nice. And passengers also just sat around on the deck.
Mm-hmm.
So
it was a very luxurious
it was a very luxurious ship. The passengers had many ways to enjoy themselves, but the first class passengers tended to have more things to do than the second and third class.
Yeah, right before the Titanic hit the iceberg, didn't the captain speed it up?
Yes, that night the captain did in fact speed up the ship because he wanted to get there early to surprise the passengers on their maiden voyage. They wanted to get a good reputation on the ship. Now, it wasn't technically the captain's idea to speed up. It was the owner of the ship. His name was Bruce Ismay. He was on the ship on its maiden voyage, and he wanted to have a good reputation for his ship. So he ordered the captain to light all of the boilers and set the engines to full steam ahead so that they would make it to New York a day or so early.
Yeah. And then after that, it kept going. And since there's like a mix-up, the lookout people didn't have binoculars, right?
Yes. The back before they set sail, one of the lookouts was not able to make it onto the ship, and the binoculars that they had were locked in his locker, and he had the keys, so they were unable to get binoculars, so they could not see very far on that night. And it was also a very waveless, clear night, which is an issue because the way you spot an iceberg is the waves will crash against it, forming white caps, which are visible.
Yeah, so so many different events led up to the Titanic crashing, like the binoculars and the waveless night.
Yeah, it was just all the perfect circumstances that led up to it.
Yeah, so the Titanic was considered unsinkable because it had, 15, 16 compartments in the bottom, and if 4 of them were flooded, then it could still stay afloat.
Yes, I think it was 5 of them could flood, and then 6 of them was the max before it would start to sink. Now, they were designed in bulkheads, right? The ship had 16 different compartments all split up by bulkheads, and each bulkhead went up to, I think, E deck, I believe. And the water, if there was too many of those compartments flooded, the water could go over the bulkhead and flood into the next compartment and constantly flood back and back and back before the ship would go under.
Yeah, but the way that Titanic hit the iceberg, right, it scratched open 6.
Yeah, it did. It scraped open 6. That's some debate that, and this is most likely true, that if the Titanic had hit the iceberg head on, it would have stayed afloat.
Yeah, because when it was turning, it was kind of diagonal, so the iceberg was able to scrape along the side instead of it just hitting it head on and only having 2 or 3 compartments flooded.
Yeah. So, after it hit, when it was hitting, what happened was the lookouts spotted the iceberg, and they were very close to it. And the lookouts phoned down to the bridge and rang the bell 3 times, which signaled that there was an iceberg straight ahead. And one of the officers picked up the phone and heard that there was an iceberg right in front of them. So they quickly had to run over to the wheel and steer it hard to port, which is left. Port is left, starboard is right on a ship. And he also ran over to one of the telegraphs and ordered the ship to go in full reverse. But to do that, they would have to stop the engines and then reverse them to prevent back pressure from blowing up the cylinders.
Yeah.
So after that, they pushed the wheel hard over to port, and the rudder was very small for the ship.
Yeah.
So it did not quite turn in time, and it hit the side.
And then after that, the compartments with the engine room and stuff started to flood, right?
Yeah, the boiler room started to flood, and they had to close all the boilers to prevent an explosion and vent all the steam out,
And
also to prevent an explosion.
how long after it was struck did it start to sink?
It started to sink right after it was struck. I mean,
Well,
the water started pouring in right after.
Well, yeah, but how long after that did it actually start to go down? The people noticed it.
The people probably, I'm not 100% sure, but I would guess around a half hour. The captain ordered the passengers to put their life vests on and head up to the top deck within, I'd say, 15, 20 minutes of the strike.
Yeah, and there are only enough lifeboats to hold about half of the passengers if all of the lifeboats were filled to max capacity. But the thing is, like, most of the lifeboats weren't filled to half or full capacity, right?
Yeah, they were not filled to full capacity. The officers claimed that they were worried the lifeboats would buckle, which they were tested to hold over their capacity, and they did not buckle. So it's a claim that happened. The first couple lifeboats were launched half capacity, or even some under half capacity.
Yeah.
And most passengers returned indoors because it was a freezing cold night out in April.
Yeah. Also, like, most of the rich passengers who were smart at least, got on like a boat, but most of the poor people who were in the lower decks couldn't get on the boats, right?
That's correct. The Titanic was built very complex. It was not an easy ship to navigate. So some of the passengers below decks were unable to navigate to the top decks quick enough. And if you've seen the Titanic movie, you see that there were gates that were shut on the passengers below decks, which it's very over exaggerated, but there were maybe one or two cases of a gate being shut on them. But in that movie, it's very over exaggerated.
Yeah. How did the ship actually sink? Like, I know it broke into two, but like, how did that work?
So the water started flooding into the bow of the ship, which is the front. Bow is the front of a ship, stern is the back. And the bow started to sink under the water, which meant the stern, which was still full of air, started to lift out of the water. And this meant, since the stern was full of all the engine equipment, as it lifted out of the water, eventually the stress on the hull became so great that it split in two. And then the bow sunk underwater, and the keel held the bow and the stern together. Like, the keel is the very bottom of a ship. It's very thick and solid. So as the bow started to sink down, the keel was still attached, and it pulled the stern, like, say this was the ship, right? It snapped in two, the bow started to go under, but since the keel was still attached, it pulled the stern back up.
So it was like vertical, right?
It was vertical, like nearly 90 degrees.
Yeah.
And eventually the keel detached from too much stress, and the stern bobbed for a bit because the bottom was still full of air. But eventually that air became so compressed that it started blowing out the sides of the ship, and it started to sink down vertically until it eventually just dipped below the water.
When it dipped below the water, it created a lot of suction, right?
Well, it created less suction than anticipated. Most passengers in the water were not saved by the lifeboats for two reasons. A, they were worried that too many passengers would try and climb on the lifeboats, swamping them.
Yeah.
And B, they were worried that the suction of the ship going down might pull the lifeboats down with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. But like you said, they waited too long, and they only saved, what, 2 people from everybody who ended up in the water?
Not many people at all. Most of them had died from hypothermia. In that temperature of water, you would die within 10 to 15 minutes of being in the water. Your heart would shut down.
Yeah, I think maybe we should start talking about, like, what happened after the Titanic sunk. Like, when did, like, other ships come to save the people, and what happened, like, as a long-term effect of the sinking?
Well, after the ship dipped below the water, the passengers on the lifeboats had to sit there the entire night until the morning when the Carpathia arrived. It had received the distress signal from Titanic before she went under and knew the coordinates at which it sank. So the passengers in the lifeboats were eventually picked up the next morning by the Carpathia, and they were brought to New York.
Yeah. Let's talk about the long-term effects of the sinking. So, like, one of the things I think is that all boats now are required to have more than enough lifeboats to fit every single passenger.
Yeah, that's true. Titanic did not have nearly enough lifeboats to fit every single passenger. They did not add that many lifeboats because they didn't want the deck to be all cluttered.
Yeah, because, like, they thought the ship was unsinkable, of course, so they didn't.
Yeah, they didn't think they needed it. Nowadays, ships, like, even though there is such an unbelievably low chance that they're going to sink,
Yeah.
they still have to have more than enough lifeboats for each passenger.
Yeah, because, like, after that disaster, nobody wanted to see another disaster like that happen again, especially with such a big, expensive ship. And, like, all the lives of the people that were lost. Like, how many people do you think lost their lives?
I think it was around 1,900.
Yeah, and there were, like, 3,000-ish passengers on the ship. That's almost half of the people on the ship who
More
died.
than half.
Yeah.
It's 2/3.
Yeah,
It's a lot.
it is.
So much life was lost. Now, the Titanic was equipped with collapsible lifeboats too, which were boats that they were pretty much fabric sides, and they were nearly impossible to launch because they were on top of the officers' quarters and were very hard to get down. One of them ended up being capsized, and funny story, one of the passengers, he wasn't even a passenger, he was
Yeah,
a
the
crew
baker.
member. He was the baker. He got so drunk on the night of the sinking that when he was in the water, he didn't die. He stayed in there for, say, an hour and a half, 2 hours, and something with the alcohol in his bloodstream kept him alive.
Yeah, like, the alcohol, like, changed his body chemistry, and either, like, it insulated him somehow, or he produced more body heat.
Yeah.
And he managed to get on top of the capsized boat and survive
Until the Carpathia
Yeah.
picked them up the next morning.
crazy stories. And there were, like, super brave people in the bottom of the ship who were working the electric breakers.
That's true. They had to constantly reset the breakers as they were short-circuited by the water flooding in.
Yeah, and the electricity, like, stayed on, like, up until, like, a few minutes before the break, like, the ship breaking.
Yeah. They were people say the bravest on the ship because they sacrificed their own lives to keep everyone else safe.
Because you need electricity to see, and it helped keep the passengers calm and, like, orderly to get off the boat.
That's true. Yeah. It's crazy.
A lot of good stories from the Titanic, and bad ones.
Yeah, it was a terrible night.
Yeah.
Lots happened. Well, is there anything else you want to go over?
I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today on the Stuff Podcast.
I'm Ethan Sauter,
I'm Quinlan Williams.
and have a
Have
nice
a nice
day.
day.